All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to see all of you here, and it's a pleasure also to have so many people joining us online. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. My name is Frank Neville. I'm the president here at Millsaps College, and I am joined tonight by Dr. Eric Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt is an assistant professor of government and politics here at Millsaps. He's been with us since the fall of 2023, so you've got like 50% more seniority here than I do. So, but Dr. Schmidt is an expert in American politics, in political polarization, and he's written this book that you can purchase online if you want, The Political Dynamics of Partisan Polarization. And he also teaches politics, government, constitutional law, et cetera, here at Millsaps. He is also the co-coordinator of our Civil Discourse initiative. He is the chair of the Pre-Law Steering Committee. He is also the advisor for the Legislative Fellows Program. So Dr. Schmidt is deeply involved in the things that he teaches about as well. Dr. Schmidt did his undergraduate study at University of Wisconsin-Madison, did graduate study at Duke, and got his PhD in political science at Indiana. So we are very, very pleased. I am very pleased that Dr. Schmidt is here at Millsaps and is with us here this evening. So, now the topic this evening is reflections on the American experiment at 250 years of age. And this conversation itself is also an experiment. This is a pilot for what we hope might be a continuing series of conversations that we convene here at Millsaps about topics of interest to the community. And this is a reflection of our commitment here to be a convening place for the community, where ideas are discussed, where knowledge is advanced, and where we come together to think about common issues, common problems, common solutions. And we thought it was particularly relevant to talk about American democracy, given that we are about to celebrate the 250th founding of this country. I guess technically the Constitution didn't get ratified until later, but as far as the patriots of 1776 were concerned, July 4th meant independence. So 250 years later, here we are. And the question is, so, how is this going? And the United States is sometimes referred to as a great experiment in democracy because the concepts on which our political system was founded were considered radical at the time. And so, Dr. Schmidt, you're an expert in the American Constitution. You've studied it, you've taught it. Maybe just to ground us, to start us off, you could talk about what were some of those radical concepts? What were some of those foundational principles?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, President Neville, first off, for your leadership and your commitment to civil discourse. Okay, the Constitution. Like President Neville said, it's not quite the 250th anniversary of the Constitution, but that really is the foundation of the whole experiment. If you haven't read the Federalist Papers, you can't really fully appreciate what the experiment is about, or, as President Neville said, just how radical it was. I guess I could give you like the Schoolhouse Rock overview and act as if all of these institutions are self-justifying. Just say, okay, separation of powers between Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary, and federalism, separate sovereigns with different responsibilities, running in parallel, and checks and balances in the exercise of power. And I could say, of course, these are good things, but there's really no of course about it. It's a grand experiment in democratic theory. The framers of the US Constitution were telling us, you have democracy all wrong. You have democracy all wrong. Two big points, I think, that encapsulate everything that the American experiment is all about. Point one, and it's just an argument about democracy. Point one is that democracy is about the preservation of liberty rather than the enactment of majority rule. That's a huge concept, that you have a democracy when you have a system that protects liberty. You don't have a democracy because you took a vote. You don't have a democracy because you took a vote. So if that's your North Star philosophy, you should actually make it really difficult. Not impossible, but difficult to change policy. Because you don't want policy to be changing all the time. You really want checks and balances. You want an independent judiciary. You don't want Congress enacting bills of attainder that are sentencing specific individuals and issuing specific punishments. You don't want any of that. The second idea, the second foundation, is that democracy is more about the representation of interests than it is about the tallying of votes. The concept of pluralism also falls out of the Federalist Papers. The legitimacy of the government comes again not by dint of the fact that the decisions government makes have the support of 50% plus one of the folks that are making a decision, but the key players in society, different interests, no matter how big or small they are, affected by a policy that's on the agenda, all weigh in. Don't all get exactly what they want, but all have some representation. That's good for liberty because, you don't want the government to be changing policy all the time arbitrarily. It's also good for policy because you don't want any one group, no matter how big, to make policy based on its own narrow self-interest. The sum total of what I've just said is that the framers were telling us that democracy works best when you have anti-majoritarian institutions that cut against majority rule. That is a huge, counterintuitive, weird for its time concept.
So this representation of interest, then, in order to get that, you need to compromise, right? You need different groups to come together and to get, I think when you said, some of what they want, but not all of what they want, and you don't want any one group to get all of what it wants. And so this is a very interesting, concept, and it seems actually appropriate, though, because you had a disparate, group of citizens at that time, a disparate group of interests, and so, and this is something you and I have talked about, is negotiation theory will tell you that there are two types of negotiations, by the way. One is distributive, where it's zero sum, right? Where you split $100 and one person gets 60 and the other gets 40. Second type is integrative, where it's win-win, right? And distributive is fine if it's just a one-off transaction and you leave the courtroom and you never see one another, but integrative, where it's win-win, where you need to compromise, is best when you have to see that person again, right? And so, everybody's stuck here, but here in the United States, right? And so we got to live with one another, right? So, coming up with these structures so that you're forcing compromise, so that you're not allowing any one group to dominate, seemed like a good idea, right, for the political reality that the United States had at that time. Well, fast forward 250 years, and compromise seems to be kind of hard, it seems like at times not only is not one group not getting all of what they want, but nobody's getting what they want. So, how do you make this work? How do you make compromise work? How do you make this system that has all of these checks actually work?
It's a great question, and it definitely can't be answered in a couple minutes, but I appreciate the focus on negotiation because the Constitution demands negotiation, and the period of time that we're living through may indeed be a period of time where you can't make it work. But understanding why you can't make it work is the first step toward figuring out how it might change and what it might look like when it changes. So what we're seeing right now is a perfect storm of factors, President Neville, that have collided to create this really weird sort of off-equilibrium moment where it's not just that it's difficult to make policy because there's checks and balances, but the two sides cannot agree and refuse to compromise with each other. That's polarization. Why is it happening right now the way that it is? I'd point to two things. They're not the only two things, but I think that they're the two most important. The first is, and I have to tell my students that it wasn't always this way. You can't take for granted that this is the case. The alignment in the United States right now between political party identity and ideological orientation. Political parties don't need to be particularly ideological. And in fact, if you just told me, hey, you have an enormous country and it's a two-party system, what do the parties look like? I would say they're not ideological. They're internally divided on lots of different things because they're trying to appeal to the median voter and they're trying to make good policy, period. And they need to have enormous coalitions that they're weaving and stitching together really precariously. But it's an accident of American political development right now that we have two political parties in this country that are unified behind these grand competing ideologies. So you got a Republican Party that's conservative on social welfare, cultural, racial, foreign policy issues, four big domains of public policy. We're sort of maxing out what public policy is about there, and a Democratic Party that's liberal on all of those things. And you might say, well, why is Dr. Schmidt saying conservative and liberal? Because the parties have done a really good job convincing their supporters that these policy positions go together, that they have something to do with some overarching ideology. If you have parties that are about ideology, that means that you also have parties that are about values. And when there are value divides, zero-sum thinking seems like the right move. Because why would you compromise over something that is core to what you believe is the good and the righteous and the just? The other thing that's just as important, I think, is that while in most states the political parties are not terribly competitive, at the national level they're really competitive. Between 2000 and 2024, there's only one presidential election in that mix where just about everybody knew who the winner was going to be 3 weeks in advance. The others you really had to, at least check the polls the day before, probably watch the night of. And party control of Congress for most of US history did not change as rapidly and frequently as it does now. So you spoke about negotiation. Negotiation requires you to understand what cards you hold now and what cards you're likely to hold 2, 4, 6 years down the line. If you're the minority party in Congress right now, all you need to do is wait to take back Congress to hold what you perceive to be all the cards. If the negotiating positions of the majority and minority parties are changing because the identity of the majority party is changing every 2, 4 years, that's creating a dynamic where the norms that foster negotiation don't get broken in. So it's really this perfect storm of lots of things, but one, ideological politics, two, hyper-competitive parties at the national level. And you have both of those things, you have zero-sum thinking.
So are we then just stuck with this? I mean, is this balance that is creating all of this perfect storm that you just outlined, is that something that we're just going to have to live with, this polarization, this gridlock, this zero-sum?
Well, it won't get better by tomorrow morning, but it's to understand why we're not stuck with it, you have to understand what I mean when I say party system. When I say party system, I don't mean that there's two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. A party system is a period of time where the groups that compose the major parties and the things that the parties disagree about are relatively stable. They show way more continuity than change. And the party system that we're in right now has all of the features that I just laid out. We know what partisan conflict is about, and we know what it's not about. It seems to be about everything. Partisan politics is only about what it's about until it's not about it anymore. And how do party systems change? Well, he passed away last summer, but my dissertation advisor, Ted Carmines, who I co-authored that book with, did a lot of work in the 1980s on this. Party systems change by accident. You have an issue that sort of erupts to the surface of the national consciousness. It doesn't currently divide the parties, but it's contestable. Mm-hmm. You can have different sides line up for or against some solution to a particular problem. And one of the political parties discovers by accident that it can win elections by staking out a really clear position at the national level on that issue. And that has implications for elite behavior, and the other party feels forced to stake out its own competing position. And because it's a cross-cutting issue cleavage, this has the effect of fundamentally reorganizing the party coalitions. Now think about all of the technological changes that are transforming the economy and parts of the social order over the next 10, 15 years. The number of issues coming down the pike with realigning potential, it's stratospheric. I don't know what the realigning issue that busts up the current political order is going to be, but whatever it is, it would be like lightning striking twice for it to produce parties that are as ideological as they are now and as competitive at the national level as they are now. So it'll change. It'll take a generation after that realigning issue has made itself known, but it'll change. So we should be teaching our students how to, actually we should be telling our students that they'll be living most of their lives in a United States that's much less polarized than it is right now.
Okay, so that's a very interesting point. So you said we should be teaching students to prepare for a less polarized world. So tell me more about that.
Yeah. Well, it means that we're teaching them to not simply recreate the political theater of polarization while they're at college. The worst thing that I could do is just say, hey, isn't it fun when Republicans and Democrats disagree? Let's have debate after debate after debate after debate where Republicans and Democrats disagree. Why don't I teach students how to take the conversations that they find uncomfortable and challenging and not move towards some moderating position that I can't force upon any student, but why don't we teach students how to negotiate, as you put it? Why don't we teach students how to reject zero-sum thinking? Why don't we leverage the fact that the country is so polarized to train our students to do something that very few people can do right now, which is sit in a room for 5-10 minutes with somebody that opposes everything that they stand for and not, flee in rage, right? That's a skill. It helps if you hone it a little bit, but let me tell you about our Civil Discourse project, which President Neville mentioned. We rolled this out last fall. It's about 10 or 11 faculty and staff members working on this all of last summer. And we tasked a group of students, 11 or 12 students, representing a diverse range of political perspectives, all the way from far right to far left and everything in between. And we said, hey, we're going to give you a really easy issue to think about, immigration. For the fall semester, we're going to charge you with negotiating policy agreements on as many of the questions in this charging document as you can. And the students, they formed their own caucuses. They learned that the point of political parties is actually to help you negotiate. It's not to tell you who to hate. They set their own ground rules. They did their own research. They became more humble by acknowledging what they didn't know. And they all learned something. And now those students are going to be able to replicate that experience in whatever high-impact career they select into. It may not necessarily be in government, but they've learned how to negotiate. And so if we can take the present period of polarization and say, well, the silver lining here is that very few people can do certain things in a polarized culture. Let's teach our students how to do that. Then I think we're on solid ground. So we're repeating the whole cycle again in the fall with a different issue. We don't know what it's going to be yet, but it's going to be fun.
Well, that sounds great, and obviously, I've been part of this, so I firmly believe, in the value of all of those things. But, this was a small group in a controlled environment, led by, friendly faculty mentors. But the world around is very different, right? You talked about it's still a polarized environment. And I have talked to individual students, who have expressed real concern about expressing any sort of political or social view, and expressing, concern about maintaining friendships if they say the wrong thing in the wrong context. I mean, to the point of, if somebody, learns that their friend voted, for a different party, then maybe they can't be their friend anymore. And this is not, I just want to let you know, like, this is not just restricted to college-age students. Now, college-age students have, I think, other pressures. I think the social media bubble that our college students live in is pretty scary. It's not one that I lived in. If I did something stupid when I was 18 years old, the 3 people that were there would laugh at me and tell others afterwards of the stupid thing I did. But nobody could take their phone and video me and make me the laughingstock of 3 million people online, right? So I think we're living in an environment where there are these pressures that run very counter to what you're talking about. And the final thing I want to say this, sorry, there's a question here, Eric, but this is not restricted to college-age people. So I was at a dinner, I will not say where and when, but in the relatively recent past, and I was sitting at a table, and I got a question from somebody at the table about what's going on with the US and Iran. Now, for those of you who don't know my background, I used to be a US diplomat, so I get these questions of like diplomacy and war and these types of things because people, think that I have some insider's understanding of these things. And so we talked about it a little bit, and the person sitting next to me, who's older and smarter and more successful than I will ever be, said to me, can we just not talk about this? This is going to divide the table. So I just sort of quietly then, answered the question, and we went on to other topics. So it's not just 18-year-olds, it's 75-year-olds who are also, stuck in this sort of fearful environment. So, like, how do you take this, this pilot, which I think we all agree was very useful, and have a broader impact when, it feels like all the pressures are pushing in the opposite direction?
Right, it's a great question. Yeah, the students that are going to be more interested in vocalizing their political views, or at least tolerating opposing views, are going to self-select into an initiative like this. I think that faculty everywhere, not just at Millsaps, everywhere need to be building in just basic principles of civil discourse pedagogy into the way that we're interacting with our students and the way that we talk to them about what political conversation is. So I sometimes tell students, look, if you express a political position to me or to one of your classmates, you've not signed in blood a lifelong commitment to a particular set of beliefs. You are trying on a particular attitude. You're giving voice to it to see if it makes sense when you say it, and to see if it's the kind of belief that you want to graft onto your identity. And sometimes it's going to be, and more often than not, it's not going to be. We learn what we don't believe by saying it first and learning that we don't believe it. Like, that's a very common phenomenon. So making sure that students know that just because you hear somebody say something does not mean that they're going to be endorsing that tomorrow, let alone for the next 10 years. The other thing that you can tell students who really are coming at this with pretty fully formed political attitudes is that there is a difference between holding a principled, unwavering belief about how the world should be and making a pragmatic decision about what's possible by way of consensus building, expanding the zone of agreement, negotiating. So, I mean, what I tell students in the Civil Discourse Project is I'm not expecting you all to think that the policy that you come up with at the end of the semester is better than what you privately believe. It's just an improvement on the status quo with respect to all of the different positions that you came at the project from. I mean, so telling students that entertaining other perspectives does not mean that you're compromising on values and beliefs that might be very sincere to you. I mean, I would never tell somebody who had a deeply felt and openly expressed set of religious beliefs that simply by talking with someone from a different faith tradition, that they were somehow doing violence to their own core identity within whatever religious tradition they were coming from. No, we learn who we are. We learn what we believe by dialoguing with people who don't see things exactly our way. We refine our views. Helping people understand the difference between the insights that come from iterative interaction with people that don't see the world your way and the beliefs that you might still continue to hold all along, that's huge too. That's huge too. Helping students see these differences. You just break through. You empower people to have the dialogue that seems scary at first, but when you add those conditions to it, it seems less scary.
Yeah, so when I hear you talk about this, I hear echoes of sort of the process of scholarly inquiry, right? You have a theory, you test it, you kick it around, you look for alternative explanations, you send it out to your publisher, they spill red ink on it, you come back and rewrite it, you publish it, people criticize it, you write a second version, something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's great for learning and advancing our knowledge of things, you know, to do that. But, you know, ultimately, as I talked about at the very beginning, you know, we've got 300 million people that are within the same borders.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's some very scary polling out there, one of which, I think it's Pew Research, reported that between like 65 and 70% of Democrats and Republicans believe that the supporters of the other party are not just wrong, but immoral. So hard enough to learn, but even harder to do. So how, you know, back to that, if we've got 300 million people within these borders, and doing nothing, gridlock is not a great solution, and yet we have, you know, this tremendous headwind of perception and polarization. How do we bring people from listening to collaborating across difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. In terms of elites in government, as I said, that's just going to need to work itself out. I'm training the next generation of students that are going to serve in government and hopefully be more interested in negotiating and dialoguing across difference. I'm interested in laying a foundation now by teaching students norms of discourse and disagreement and intellectual curiosity that do bust through much of that sort of initial instinct to recoil from an idea that we despise or distrust. I'd be a lot more scared if the people who said, hey, it's immoral, were just sort of blindly hating a particular group of people. Blindly immoral, right? If you make a value judgment, hey, this person's immoral and I don't know why, well, that's just straight up prejudice. If you say it's immoral because I understand or think that I understand the other side's belief systems really well, and I've concluded that they're immoral, that I can work with. That I can work with all day long. And it's the Americans that feel most negatively about the opposing party who also who are also strongest in their own policy convictions. Some people in that book said something along those lines. So yeah, it's the way forward is to remind people that the value judgments that seem so brutal are actually motivated by ideas, and ideas we can work with. If they weren't, then I'd be a lot more scared. But I can work with ideas. I can work with the idea that, student A thinks that student B is immoral because they believe this, and this. And student B thinks the same thing about student A. I can work with that. It's a lot harder to work with student A and student B hate each other for no reason. But we know the reason. We know the reason. If the reason is ideological disagreements and value disagreements, well, then we can teach people, as I said just a moment ago, we can teach people to differentiate between points of agreement, pragmatic compromises that improve the status quo, and actually abandoning or somehow surrendering the values that you care about. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. And I think we have time now for some questions from our audience. I think we'll start here in the room, in person. And we've got a microphone, and since we have people listening online, it's important that you use the microphone, even though we probably can hear you if you don't use it. So I think, Caleb, we've got a question over here. And then once we take a few questions in the room, I believe we've got some questions from our online viewers as well, and we'll be happy to take those.
Just to bring this down to what I deal with every day in terms of talking with friends, how much do you think President Trump's situation and following is a product of the division in the country versus his unique personality causing a lot of that division and animosity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I never like to blame polarization on any one particular political figure. The parties have been polarizing since the late 1960s and 1970s. A lot of people have been president during that period of time. A lot of people have been senators. A lot of people have been House members. I think that there are lots of politicians right now who embody the intensity of an intensifying polarized culture. And so I'm hesitant to attribute anything to any one person's personality, but it's a reasonable question.
As you're teaching your few students, relatively few students about this, there are well-funded institutions of discord teaching thousands and thousands of Americans to not like the other guy. The rise of dark money and the influence of money, the institutions now that serve discord, that's left out of your thesis as I hear it.
And if I could just ask for some clarification, what specifically is left out?
The influence of these institutions and the rise of dark money, the Koch brothers and all they do and the other side, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they thrive on building discord among Americans.
Yeah, so I'm not actually an expert on campaign finance. I'm familiar
It's beyond
enough.
campaigns, beyond campaigns.
Uh-huh.
This is social media targeted to discard. This is broadcast, TV media, online media, targeting messages that preach discord.
What I would say simply in response to that is that there are so many forces, known and unknown, that are, as I said, sort of coagulating to create a perfect storm of polarization. I listed the two that I see as most pivotal, but no matter what else we add to that list, we need to be able to work through it, because what choice do we have?
Oh, yes, we do need to. I want you to tell me how.
What choice do we have?
Well, let me maybe address that with a couple other additional points. So, you know, what you've talked about in terms of social media in particular, and, you know, people who want to divide Americans for whatever reason, and, you know, there's some good documentation of, you know, foreign actors being involved in there. You know, I'll remind you of something that was said 250 years ago, is united we stand, divided we fall. And I think it starts with us, you know, remembering that, number one. The second thing that I will say is it's important, I mean, this is why a place like Millsaps is so important, right? Because what we do, what our faculty do and have done here long before I arrived, is to teach people how to think critically and to engage with ideas with a discerning mind, and to ask the question of, you know, well, what evidence is there for that idea? What are alternative ideas? To think critically about every piece of information that's put in front of you. And a citizenry that has critical thinking skills is going to be able to do the things that Dr. Schmidt is talking about that will help, you know, reduce polarization. Now, because it is policy-based, I mean, his research on this says it's about real things. It's about real differences, about real policies. That then the third piece has to be civil discourse. It has to be, because otherwise you're abandoning yourself to gridlock. And we've seen that, we've seen the price of that, and I think we all agree that that is not the society that any of us want. So how do you collaborate across difference? So we have agency over a tiny little corner of this world, but we do have a megaphone, and we do have, you know, the great opportunity to help young people learn a different approach, practice a different model, and go out and make a difference in the world. So there are things that we can do, and there are things that we are doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Tom Shima, a very proud 1987 Millsaps alum. And thank you for doing this. Just a side note, my grandmother, who was graduate of Millsaps in 1905, was like, she loved coming back to Millsaps to do just exactly this sort of stuff. But I'm not really posing a question. I want to share something maybe silly and trivial that kind of gives me hope in what feels like sometimes a hopeless era, and it is Netflix. And what I mean by that, I wish I was saying, like, I've been reading great books on history, but Archie Bunker, All in the Family, you know, late 1960s, The West Wing, early 2000s, watching a recent documentary on the Vietnam War era and all of just the atrociousness and terrible things and polarization in those times. And I look at, it was like, it sounded so bad in the 1960s, and we survived. And it sounded so bad in the early 2000s, and we survived. And yes, I do feel like things are a little bit different now, but it does give me hope, reflecting back on some pretty awful eras in our, well, painful eras in our history. Like I said, it's not really a question, but if there are any comments you have on like what history tells us.
No, but it's a really good insight, and I thank you for it. It's not the kind of polarization that we're in right now is partisan ideological polarization. The thing, I mean, the periods of time that you're talking about were full of division. It's just that the division didn't involve two rigidly ideological political parties that endorsed grand competing ideologies and had flocks of supporters behind them that were unified behind them. So, yeah, when the present period of polarization gives way to a different party system, we're still going to have political divisions, maybe some rising to the level of the divisions that you've cited, but hopefully we'll have a toolkit that a few of us have honed for dealing with those. Yeah.
I think this may be related to that. One salient thing I heard you say that stuck with me was that the way you put it, party systems change by accident. Mm-hmm. Could you just give I don't want to assume anything about what those accidents or shifts are about, but would you mind giving an example or two?
Sure, and
maybe if you use your crystal ball to look in the future, what that next one might be.
You just don't know until it happens. So the book that this comes out of was written by Ted Carmines and Jim Stimson in 1989. It's a book called Issue Evolution, and it's about the Southern realignment. And their insight was that the Democratic Party learns in 1958 that if it runs candidates who support the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the northeastern states, that they can do pretty well. And this convinces the party in due order to take a national level position on civil rights in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. That has the effect, again, it takes about a generation, but that has the effect of producing a party system where an issue that didn't divide the parties between 1932 and 1958 or so, namely civil rights, becomes one of the, if not the, major focal point of partisan conflict. I mean, the Republican Party could have just as easily have sort of had the intuition that it could emerge as the political party that, could win by supporting the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's an interesting hypothetical to run. The racial realignment of the 1960s is one key example. The New Deal realignment of the of the early Great Depression era is the other pivotal example. There aren't many, and I don't know what the next one's going to be, but there are so many that could be, is my point.
Or did we want to?
Yes, well, let's pivot to our online audience tonight. So from Rob and Linda Rice, the request is please comment on the apparent to me erasure of balance of powers, executive, judicial, legislative. What might restore that balance? That's right, get ready.
President Neville, would you like to take
Easy
that one?
question.
No. I would respectfully challenge the premise of the question, not because I don't understand that the current balance between executive, legislative, judicial power isn't different than it was. But The Constitution is ambiguous for a reason. Even people who are convinced that you need to look toward the original intent of the people that framed the U.S. Constitution disagree about exactly what they meant. So knowing that, I think it's more useful to say that different eras experience different iterations of the separation of powers that look different than the previous era. That exactly how to do the separation of powers has never been totally clear. And that different eras of constitutional law, I have like 4 students from my con law class here, we've talked all about this. Different eras of con law disagree about what separation of powers looks like. Polarization gives the impression that the fundamental tenets of the Constitution are being tested in major ways because the more intense and polarized the parties become, the more unanswered constitutional questions end up before the Supreme Court for their review. And it's almost an optical illusion of sorts. I mean, okay, the Supreme Court, by dint of polarization, has an opportunity to weigh in on this, and this, and this. And then it looks like we're just rewriting the whole Constitution, but we're not. We're just answering, for a time at least, previously unanswered constitutional questions. They might be answered differently in a few generations. So the question is well put, well stated. I would just say separation of powers is pretty messy, and I wouldn't want to pin myself down, one definite way to do it.
Thank you. One more question from Glenn Rawson. Good discussion of taking the pilot, I assume the civil discourse pilot, to the larger stage. So how does an individual that is not part of the pilot do the same? How does the individual contribute to moving away from deadlock to a system of negotiation?
You could start by thinking about what are the 3 issues, three policy positions that I have that I consider to be totally non-negotiable. Write them down. I know that nobody's going to do this, right? But write them down, and then for each one of them, write a paragraph that attempts to articulate the best possible counter-argument to what it is that you believe. Because we cannot be carrying around with us long, neurotic lists of things that we can't wait for our political opponents to say so that we can throw a fit and leave the conversation. We can't be doing that. We need to learn the vocabulary of people who disagree with us so we can disagree with them more effectively and learn things. That's, I think, how we at an individual level break through some of this. That's one helpful suggestion that I would just lob out there.
Yeah, I would add another, Eric, and it's interesting that you use that example because I did this to the poor students in my class this spring, where I had a series of criticisms of American behavior that they were asked to defend. I think it's important. The first step is to understand the perspective of the other. You can't deal effectively with it unless you understand it. So I think, writing down an argument or asking questions or understanding, like, why does somebody feel that way? And going from there. Now, at the end of that, where you land in terms of, what you think about the issue, is hard to predict. But I think if to your point, blindly hating somebody is a bad place to be. Understanding the true sort of difference and why there's a difference could expose some common ground. And I think, it's interesting on a lot of on a lot of public policy issues, you find still, a center grouping of consensus that, because of this broader polarization, it's hard for us to activate. So I think, what I will say to sort of summarize all of that is looking first for the things that unite us. Start there, because that's how you conduct a successful negotiation. That's how you start to break down the cycle of polarization.
Our next question is from Bob Leggett. Hi, Bob. How can one negotiate when facts are in dispute, or even unable to determine exactly what it means to be a fact?
Well, the premise of that question is that that the era that we're in right now is unique in the sense that people disagree about what the truth is. I mean, an awful lot of politics is disagreeing about what the truth is. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately. The cool thing today is we have Google, and lots of students go to college, and this gets to a question that was asked earlier about social media influencers and people who try to mold minds to a particular perspective. Really try to train students, I think, to sort of challenge what they read, not take what they read at face value, and assume that neither side is in full possession of the truth. I mean, historians 100 years from now are going to say things about the current era that are wildly different from what we take to be the defining properties of this era. We shouldn't be operating from the assumption that we're in unique possession of the truth and the other side is not. Maybe some of the time that's true, I don't know, but what an unhelpful thing to think. What an unhelpful thing to bring to the table. Because it can't just be a dispute about the facts. It's also a value dispute at the end of the day. It's also a policy ideological dispute. Treat it like that. I would say don't be so distracted by these sort of allegedly post-truth claims of somebody with whom you're disagreeing, that you don't engage with the substance of what they're saying. And I mean, the students in the Civil Discourse Project were corrected on many occasions on lots of things that they were pretty sure about. And they were pretty sure that their opponents were totally wrong about, factually, morally, all the way down. So the answer to the question is to not think of this era as being uniquely problematic in terms of truth claims that might be suspect. I mean, go back to the debates surrounding the ratification of the Constitution. A lot of nasty things were said. A lot of them probably weren't true. Okay.
Yeah, I think Lloyd was next. Yep.
There are, of course, as you say, two ideologically opposed parties, but also now we see within the parties some divisions emerging, some that have been there a long time, some that are newer, splits in the MAGA coalition and other things like that. But on the Democratic side, how do we win elections? Do we go far left? Do we go to the center? What is your perspective on the impact, if any, that these divisions within the party are going to have on polarization or new realignment?
Right. I'm familiar with many of the internal fissures that you're talking about, and they're the type of thing that I would flag as potentially of interest, but likely not to have any realigning potential. Because if the disagreement is just, are we going to campaign as moderate liberals or extreme liberals, or moderate conservatives or extreme conservatives, that's still within the ballpark of the current party system. I don't think I've seen a disagreement within a party in government, I guess in my brief tenure so far as a person with a PhD in political science, that I think would rise to the level of a realigning issue. I think that if it's something that If it's a disagreement about how to express the party's ideology most cogently, that's not a realigning issue, unfortunately. But any internal fissures I flag and I monitor and I keep track of them. I'm told that 5 minutes remain.
So where does this polarization leave America on the global stage? Things like the Belt and Road from China or the Middle East or the Iran war, has this polarization diminished our capacity to be the world's leader?
I almost think that President Neville would be in a stronger position to answer this. And I say that because I'm simply not an expert in international relations. My gut feeling is no, but I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's a question that I think every world leader in every capital around the globe is asking. And I'll go back to what I said before about, the united we stand. And I think the United States has tremendous resources that, if they're concentrated, are without match in the world. And I spent 9 years in China, and I'm not too concerned about the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, as a challenge to American power. But it's aligning those resources around common purpose that is the hard thing to do. The final thing I'll say, though, is the sources of American power, this is my personal perspective, the sources of American power are obviously informed by our geography and our natural resources, but it really boils down to the free flow of people, capital, and ideas. That is what has made the United States great. Okay? The free flow of immigrants that has made this a home to 300 million plus people. The fact that the most talented people in the world have wanted to come here for a long time and have contributed to this society in tremendous ways. We could spend hours, giving examples of that. Capital, where we have a society that does not restrict flows of capital to those who have preferred access to capital. Capital flows are much more democratic here. And capital investment is something that happens on scale and for the benefit of the broader society. And then the third piece is ideas. As I talked about before, once you start shutting off ideas, you by definition start to curb innovation. And so those three things are really the sources of American power. And so I think, my suggestion to everybody is, to make sure that those sources of strength remain robust. And, the rest of it, I think will largely take care of itself. Okay, I think let's, we are 2 minutes away from time, so let's take one final question here and we'll wrap up.
I got a real long one, but I'll make it very short. I've really appreciated this very much. I just finished reading the book Poisoned Ivies by Elise Stefanik. And, she came on the scene, when she asked them the big question there. In her book, she talks a great deal about the lack of diversity in the faculty across the United States. After hearing what you're saying, maybe it's not so much that we need equilibrium in that as much as we need a way to make sure that the professors that are teaching are listening and helping students to learn. My question is to you, though, about this. Do we have a way to measure in our student evaluations, do the students feel safe that they can express themselves in a class?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the details of our student evaluations. I will say, though, back to what I said before, is I think young people in general, and I think actually, adults in many cases, don't feel comfortable expressing themselves in any forum, right? So people come to this campus formed by the society around them. And so it's incumbent upon us to provide a different environment that's true to the spirit of academic inquiry, where we foster that type of discussion, where we create an environment where, ideas are tabled and discussed and, as I mentioned, beaten up and kicked around and improved through that process. So, so I think that is something that we as educators at this time and place in the United States have to be very, very attuned to, because again, we are, we receive, all of these societal influences, and we need to, and can be, a model, an example, and the seed of something different. So thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate you being here with us this evening. Thank you.